Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience, and we're delighted to see a larger than expected crowd. Always nice. And we're delighted to be here again. Some of you have been here for the last couple of talks given by our esteemed lecturer tonight, Joan Baum. For those of you who don't know Joan, and I want to mention that this talk tonight is being not only filmed by us we will put it on our website, and many people do not know that you can actually go on our website and watch many programs. But the folks from WPKN, Tommy and Matt, are here recording it, and it will be broadcast on WPKN at a future time, and you can ask them when, after this talk is over. Anyway, more about Joan. A recovering academic, Joan taught literature and writing at CUNY for many years as a tenured professor of English. Her graduate school specialty was British literary history from 1770 to 1832. Her books include The Calculating Passion of Ada Byron, about Byron's mathematical daughter, who is reputed to have been the first world's computer programmer, working with Charles Babbage, and Mind-Forged Manacles, a study of what the major English Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, did to advance ending the slave trade and slavery in Britain in the early 19th century. On retirement, she was delighted to be able to drift into other time zones, popular and scholarly. She writes regularly for Dan's papers, doing book reviews and articles, and is the book reviewer for WSHU, the Connecticut-based NPR station. Please welcome Joan Baum.
I view this talk today more as a conversation, and so I will not go on ad infinitum. I am delighted to be able to talk about ostensibly two books, Go Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set a Watchman. But the real theme of the talk has to do with an event that happened last year, Bastille Day, July 14th. In this country, it was for many parents, many teachers, and many critics, a very explosive time. And it happened to be the date on which a new novel was published. It was called Go Set a Watchman. And it was the original manuscript of one of America's most cherished, beloved novels. Still #1 on high school curriculum, To Kill a Mockingbird. And I was fascinated with the response, and therefore I call the talk Go Set a Controversy. People went crazy. The day after the book was published, there were numerous letters, and they still go on to the papers, but it was also the occasion of a well-known black lawyer from Harvard, Randall Kennedy, who wrote an explosive op-ed piece in the Times that very day, vindicating an article that had come out 23 years earlier. The article was by someone, no one heard of him, called Monroe Friedman, and the article was about To Kill a Mockingbird. The article appeared in a journal called Legal Times, read by a handful of people. But somehow word got out what was in that article. And Monroe Friedman, 23 years ago, said, enough with Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird being thought a hero, being thought a model. Nice man, did a nice job in the courtroom as best as he could, but no more celebrating this figure who has become beloved of readers and particularly of people who have seen the movie. Well, Letters poured into the Times, and as a result, they reprinted the original Monroe Freedman article. And then people wrote letters, and then finally things died down. Not on July 14th. With the publication of this manuscript, everyone thought that Monroe Freedman had been vindicated in putting the kind of kibosh on Atticus Finch, and no one more so than Randall Kennedy from Harvard. And he wrote an impassioned piece about the importance of Go Set a Watchman. So one of the things I'd like to discuss today is this controversy, because part of the problem is that people who love To Kill a Mockingbird feel a sense of ownership, and they're angry that something has been published that has a very different image of Atticus Finch. It's not necessary that you have read either book. I reread To Kill a Mockingbird. I must have read it at some point. I don't recall. And unfortunately, I saw the movie, and that killed all the reading of the book. The movie is very powerful. The movie came out in 1962, and it was published in 1960. When it came out, it was with Gregory Peck, who many people think still is Atticus Finch. And Gregory Peck, as you may remember, came off his own earlier celebration of being a hero, and he was, excuse me, he was in Gentleman's Agreement, where he portrayed someone who decided to be Jewish and test the anti-Semitism of the land, and test it he did. That was in 1947. The dates of this are very important. So first, some brief reminders of the differences between the two books. To Kill a Mockingbird, published in 1960, is set in the 1930s. Go Set a Watchman, the manuscript that became a book, which was published last year, was set in the mid-50s. This already creates a huge cultural divide in American history. When I reread To Kill a Mockingbird, I didn't feel it was a novel about race, even though it's a very exciting, dramatic narrative, the crux of which takes place in the courtroom. I felt it very much to be what I believe Harper Lee wanted it to be, a book about childhood, in the tradition of Huck Finn, Catcher in the Rye, growing up. First of all, it's in the first person. Go Set a Watchman is in the third person, and that was a very nice move, to have the events of the 30s told through the eyes of a child. Her name is Jean Louise Finch, but she's known as, everyone can say it, Scout, right? And she goes to the trial, as I said, which is at the center of the book. A black 16-year-old Tom Robinson is falsely accused of rape, and the trial takes place. We know he didn't do it, and we know he didn't do it because Gregory Peck is going to defend him. When the guilty verdict comes in, Scout's older brother Jim cries. Her best friend Dill, who is modeled on Truman Capote, also sits there stunned. And Atticus turns to his daughter and says, observing the response of the children, "Cry about the hell white people give colored folks without even stopping to think that they're people too. But one place where a man ought to get a square deal is in the courtroom, be he of any color of the rainbow. As you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't you forget it. Whenever a white man does that to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he comes from, that white man is trash. There is the gem of the original book. But in To Kill a Mockingbird, as I said, Scout is young. And it's kind of like a coming of age for her. She sees the injustice. But essentially, she takes to heart what her father tells her. This is what happens. I've done the best I can. And reinforces the title. To Kill a Mockingbird is killing the innocent. And I've often thought about that in regard to what the word innocent means. It means free from harm, free from noxious behavior and events. And that is really what To Kill a Mockingbird is about. It's a view of innocence up to the point where it becomes sad, perhaps tragic. Justice does not triumph, but childhood does. In that regard, two other quotations. One from To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus is talking to his older brother Jack, quite cynical, and says, "Children are children, but they can spot an evasion quicker than adults. And that's what the children do." So it's a wonderful reinforcement of the world of childhood. Go Set a Watchman is quite adult, quite cynical, and very nasty in its experiential view of life. Some of you here may know William Blake. He wrote poems of innocence, Little Lamb of Thee, and then paralleled all these wonderful songs and poems about innocence by parallel poems which have to do with experience, the most famous of which you've all heard, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night," and the fearful symmetry and the cold analytics that drive adults in the world of experience. And I thought of Mockingbird and Watchmen in these terms as well. But I'm also making comments. I hope I don't sound like the unretired English teacher, but I noticed things that I don't remember seeing in various articles about these books. One was the epigraph to Kill a Mockingbird, and it's taken from an essay by Charles Lamb, The Old Ventures of the Inner Temple. And here's the epigraph from Lamb. "Lawyers, I suppose, were children once." That is the mature Harper Lee laying it in. And then it goes on, because I looked up the original, and it continues. "Why must everything smack of man? Is the world all grown up? Is childhood dead? Or is there not in the bosoms of the wisest and the best some of the child's heart left, respond to in its earliest enchantments?" And again, Mockingbird is such a wonderful evocation of that world. The plot of Watchmen. It's almost plotless. There is absolutely, let me say straight up front, that between them as narrative, To Kill a Mockingbird earns its place in the curriculum. Whether it should continue there, I want to open up as a conversation when we're through. But Watchmen is very different. Excuse me, different. Jean Louise is no longer Scout. She's now Jean Louise. She's 26, and she's coming home. She's been in, ready? New York City. And this environment that she's coming back to, Macon it's called, is really Monroeville, Alabama. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say that not only on July 14th did this controversy arise with the publication of Watchmen, but it was the very month that the Confederate flags came down in Alabama. So it was a good time. Watchmen is set in the 1950s. We don't exactly know when, but we do suspect clearly it was about 1955 or slightly later. Why? because it's really on the tail of the Supreme Court's alleged most controversial and most far-reaching decision that it ever made, and that was Brown versus Board of Education, a unanimous ruling by the Warren Court, as you remember, ending segregation in the schools. It turned on an interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And although there were many, many amicus curiae, the brief that was the strongest to result in a unanimous decision in Warren's court was that argued by the NAACP. And those of you who have read, or I hope will read, Go Set a Watchman, will see that at the heart of that narrative is a hatred espoused by the White Citizens Council of the NAACP. Quoting from the book, Atticus is now in his 70s. He turns to his daughter, who has been in New York getting radicalized, and says, "Do you want Negroes by the carload in our schools and churches and theaters? Honey, you do not seem to understand that the Negroes down here are still in their childhood as people." That's in the original manuscript. And much more. As Justice Kennedy pointed out, the arguments that Atticus Finch makes in Mockingbird are those he takes on reluctantly. He didn't even want to take the case, but he does so. He sees a segregated courtroom. There's no objection. But here's what really killed readers on July 15th. Those who read the book or read the excerpts, they saw that when Jean Louise comes back and goes into her house, she sees literature. And what literature does she see? She picks it up, and it's all racist. Her father belongs to the White Citizens Council. And he goes on, really on a tear, on the NAACP. And as you remember, the person who led that attack was Thurgood Marshall. So all of this is very important. Harper Lee is still alive. That's the other part of the controversy, and I don't want to slip over that. Should this manuscript have been published? And I ask that rhetorically, because as Publishers Weekly, the trade of literature, points out, how could you not? Anything having to do with Mockingbird, another manuscript, is going to get published, even though you'll find out there's no Santa Claus. So out it is, and it has clear indications that Atticus Finch is, I don't want to use the term racist, because it's not used in the book. He is a segregationist. He gives a very strong argument in Watchmen for taking time, but clearly he has the literature in his house. He belongs to the White Citizens Council. His brother Jack is even more adamant. And I would like to suggest that if you will buy in with me a bit, that the theme of To Kill a Mockingbird is the loss of innocence and why, but the celebration of it before it's lost, of childhood, then one of the themes, clearly, of Watchmen is an intellectual or a cerebral argument about the 10th Amendment, states' rights, about the 14th Amendment, human rights. And there is, I think, the biggest difference between these two books. You read To Kill a Mockingbird, it's wonderful. Can't put it down, it's very entertaining. You won't feel that way about Watchmen, but I suggest that you will be fascinated by the complexity of the arguments that go on. It's not white versus black, racist and non-racist. It is very much current, and I'm amazed. Harper Lee may be out of it, and I think she is, either with Alzheimer's or dementia. But she was very close to her older sister, who until the day she died was a very shrewd lawyer. And they knew the law, as was Harper Lee's father. So there was no way that the arguments, the intellectual components of Watchmen were not front and center for Harper Lee. And so there are some questions to ask about the book. I brought along, and if there's time or anyone's interested, I reviewed a Watchmen, by the way, and when I did, I asked to see any PR materials, and I was sent 3 pages of Q&As called Frequently Asked Questions on the Publication of Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman. Essentially, should this manuscript have been published? How much did this woman who was, been out of it for quite some time, how much was she aware that this earliest version of To Kill a Mockingbird was going to be published? How much insight did she have? And I just highlighted, there goes the teacher again in yellow magic marker, but take a look. I had great problems with the answers that were provided by the publisher. I said, exactly, she was very much involved. And then later on I said, well, she didn't really read it. She didn't really see it. She made suggestions about the cover. But I have no doubt that she did not understand fully that someone was coming along who found the manuscript, the original To Kill a Mockingbird, in a safe place. The publisher won't even tell me if that was in a bank, and decided, whoa, this is going to be big money, big promotion. So in effect what you have is a manuscript that was written first, called Go Set a Watchman. That manuscript went to Lippincott, the publisher at the time, and the editor saw it and liked it. People who say that the editor rewrote the whole thing and didn't like it are clearly wrong. There are statements on the record that she liked it, but she sure thought it would be much better told differently, changing the whole perspective from the child, from the adult to the child, and from a third person to a first person, and focusing the narrative so that it builds to this center of the courtroom drama. The movie, by the way, is terrific. And when you reread the book, and I hope you will, Mockingbird, and then see the movie again, you'll be amazed just how close it is. But particularly the opening, which is just, again, kids at play in a rural community, a real celebration of a way of life that's gone. So I liked the idea of talking about the books, not only because of the controversy, but I also liked the kind of questions they prompted in me, and that I hope will be prompted in you. And that has to do with, well, for one thing, should manuscripts be published if they did not have the clear, imprimatur from their authors? And there certainly is a case that Harper Lee did not prove. People have asked this question about sudden findings of a Hemingway manuscript. And then everyone will write in, so sorry this has been published. It should not have been. There was a very famous literary critic in the 19th century, Matthew Arnold, who adored my adored poet, William Wordsworth, who lived to be 80, and said the only way people are going to adore Wordsworth is if he's heavily edited. And so you take a lifetime of work and you make a very judicious selection. But that is certainly one of the questions, and it's been asked about F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Last Tycoon. Things that are unpublished because their authors, for whatever reason, have decided not to. And someone comes along and says, let's go. The other question, which interests me even more, is that To Kill a Mockingbird is such a stellar book. It is owned by people, and it's what's called an American classic. And I got to wondering, what does that mean? What is a classic? Well, that's the easier part. A classic is something that transcends its time period and is universal, talks about a universal theme. But I want to submit that a classic should also not only be universal, but reflect the times out of which it comes. And I think a lot of people who have read Go Set a Watchman are now wondering whether To Kill a Mockingbird really, as the kids would say, tells it like it was in the 30s for blacks. No accident this, but the #1 bestseller in the nonfiction list today is Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which you have, if not read, have heard a lot about. And it's called Between the World and Me. And again, he's been our latest public intellectual, and it's been excerpted in many, many places. I was curious about where the title came from. I should have known, but I didn't. Does anyone here know? It comes Between the World and Me. I'll read the poem's opening lines. It's by Richard Wright. And Richard Wright is a marvelous black poet. And this poem was written in 1935. And it, much more than Mockingbird, reflects the way things were. And again, here goes the English teacher. The opening word of the poem I love. It's and. And not to sound too precious, though I suspect I am. It suggests that what's following, what's coming, has been going on forever and will. And one morning while in the woods, I stumbled suddenly upon the thing, stumbled upon it in a grassy clearing guarded by scaly oaks and elms, and the sooty details of the scene rose, thrusting themselves between the world and me. The sun died in the sky. A night wind muttered in the grass and fumbled the leaves in the trees. The woods poured forth a hungry yelping of hounds. The darkness screamed with thirsty voices, and the witnesses rose and lived. This is a violent, vicious, beautifully written account of a lynching. 1935. You just get an idea that a lynching might be afoot in Mockingbird, but here it is from a black poet, and a very powerful, powerful indictment. And for sure, Ta-Nehisi Coates knew this poem and made his own diatribe against integration and the possibility, the impossibility of peace, right from those opening lines. So I submit again that Mockingbird is a wonderful novel. I can see people are going, you know, that's fine. And I am not going to deny that it's a fine narrative. But I would really like to support your taking a look at Go Set a Watchman. The title, I wondered about that. To Kill a Mockingbird, we know, but Go Set a Watchman, so off I went again. It's from Isaiah 21:6. And Isaiah the prophet has been asked to be the watchman, to look out for when Babylon, the evil city, will fall. And he does. And he reports in the Bible that Babylon has fallen. But then he says, and morning comes, and then night. And that's, again, the cycle will return. There is no liberation. There is no happy ending. And in Watchmen, Jean Louise says, go set a watchman. Let him declare what he seeth. She recites from Isaiah. And she says, every man's watchman is his conscience, to distinguish between what someone says and what he means, to draw a line down the middle and say, here is this justice, there is that justice. I must have read that 1,000 times or so, it seemed. I couldn't understand it, and I still don't. But I spot enough ambiguity in there to recognize that you may set a watchman, you may have your conscience morally attuned to what's right, but in the real world of complexity, it is impossible to take a side, to think it's going to stay forever. And in fact, the argument in the center of the book, as I said, it's a states' rights argument, which in the South is more than states' rights. It's about family, it's about heritage, it's about a whole tradition. And by God, we're never finished with the Civil War. What's the latest? Mercy Street, another TV medical drama, but set in the Civil War. So I'm curious about its standing, To Kill a Mockingbird, as an American classic, and how that might be slightly shaved off if people knew about Watchmen. I'm also fascinated by something else that perhaps people here have thought about, and that is when I said it caused me to wonder what's an American classic, because Mockingbird is taught in American schools, middle schools and high schools and college. What's American? And I don't know the answer to that. I began to think, well, distinctively American regions come to mind. Is American, and a good case might be made, that American literature has as its heart Southern literature. And two strands of Southern literature, all the great novelists who are coming out of this conflict. And what's the South? Some of you may have read a New Yorker piece last year. I thought it was very well done by an author, Nicholas Lehman, who identified himself as a fifth-generation Southerner. And he was writing in response to this controversy about Mockingbird and Watchmen. And he says, race in the South is a complex issue. It's no longer a simple binary of racists and non-racists. And that's exactly what Atticus says to his daughter. The South is too big and powerful to be vestigial, too married to the rest of the country to stand truly apart, too distinctive in its history to be fully united with other states. One of my most favorite American writers is Southern, Flannery O'Connor. And the other strand that comes in to strengthen the idea that, what irony, that the heart of American literature, classics, is Southern. Some of you who like poetry may know of a group that flourished from the 30s on. They were called the Southern Agrarians. John Crow Ransom, Allen Tate, Truman Capote belonged to that, and John Grisham is in that tradition. These were intellectuals, and they all came out of the South. Cormac McCarthy. It's a very rich tradition, Horton Foote. And here's the point. Atticus Finch belongs to that group. He is very much part of a Southern intellectual. And his brother, Jack, even more so. I want to get, before I read something that I think will surprise you, I want to get to me, for me, at the heart of what I think is the most important question to ask, though, about both books. How do they stand up as literature? We've been talking about them as content. We've been talking about them as reflecting history, cultural history. But a good work of literature, for me, is something you would want to read again. I would read To Kill a Mockingbird again. I would not read Watchmen again. One time round was good enough, but that was a very important one time round. Watchmen, Mockingbird opens this way. I'm going to read the opening paragraph. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed and Jem's fears of ever being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right when he stood or walked. The back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. I don't know how that will go over with urban New York kids, but that is the opening of To Kill a Mockingbird. It's not exciting, but it's clearly about childhood. And now I want to read the opening of Watchmen. Since Atlanta, she had looked out the dining car window with a delight almost visible. Over her breakfast coffee, she watched the last of Georgia's hills recede and the red earth appear, and with it tin-roofed houses set in the middle of swept yards, and in the yards the inevitable verbena grew, surrounded by whitewashed tires. That is very fine writing. And it answers the charge that this was not good literature, meaning style, because when the editor saw this manuscript in 1957, she said, there it was. This is the spark of a true writer that flashes in every line. Of course, it needed work. It needed to have a coherent narrative. And that, by the way, to me is the heart of a good book. Does it tell a good story? Does it entertain? But it sure has, as literature, some really powerful writing. And again, the opening that I just read, I'm just going to read the last sentence again, because I want you to listen to what she's doing. Jean is on a train, Jean Louise. She's going back to Alabama, and she's on the train. I want you to listen to the cadence, because a good writer will pick this up. It's not just biblical, but it's the movement of the rails. And the red she watched, over her breakfast coffee, she watched the last of Georgia's hills recede, and the red earth appear, and with it tin-roofed houses set in the middle of swept yards, and in the yards the inevitable verbena grew. That's good stuff. So again, I submit, take a look at it. It's good literature. It may not be a great novel, it sure isn't. But I also want to say something else peculiar about it that people haven't commented on. It's not only literature, it's literary. And I find that the weirdest thing of all. If I had not been, as Penny introduced me, an early 19th century specialist, going beyond 1832 into the Victorian period, I wouldn't have recognized many, many references in this book that were right out of the English literary canon of the early 20th century, and particularly in the South, with good schools where Harper Lee went. The Watchmen is full of Victorian references, not only to critics, but it closes with a line that I should have recognized but didn't. Its closing line is from Gilbert and Sullivan, Ruddigore, or The Witch's Curse, 1887. Now that's really weird. Uncle Jack, her Atticus's brother, and Jean Louise have had a ferocious fight about race. It is really worth reading. It gets so bad that it gets physical, and he hits her. The language is insanely brutal, and in the course of the exchange, Jean Louise blasts her beloved father, Atticus Finch, for being a racist. Uncle Jack is furious, but somehow he calms down and comes to see her. She's going to leave for New York. She's not staying, she says. And he doesn't want it to end on this violent note. And as he comes back, he says to her, he starts singing, and it's from Gilbert and Sullivan. I once was an exceedingly odd young lady, suffering much from spleen and vapors. I mean, at that point I ran out and said, who said that? This sounds familiar, but... And he leaves. He just goes to the car. And there's a pause. And Jean Louise, after hearing what he has done, calls after him. But we only cut respectable capers. That's the last line of the book. She's indicating that she gets his message. He's making a fancy Victorian literary joke, but he's also sincerely saying, let's come together over art. And she recognizes it. She also is seeing herself as cutting some pretty respectable capers. She means that sarcastically. She means that in a sense of being critical. But she may not run back to New York as fast as she thought. She may stay and try to bridge the gap that she now has with her father. Machiko Kapitani, whom I'm not wild about, critic of the New York Times, hated this book, Watchmen. And she said, never should be published, it's terrible. But I think it is worth looking at and staying with, as I said, because of its complexity. And the irony is that I think between the two, given the high school curricula, that it's the more relevant of our time. And so I would like to end on a note where I put a question to you. What should happen to Go Set a Watchman? They're talking about a movie, of course. And there will be one, I predict. But I don't know how they'll take the intellectual core, the argument, and dramatize that. But do you think it should be added to high school reading lists, that kids should be aware of it because of the more complex, more realistic, and more relevant presentation of the most controversial issue of our country, which is race? Yes. So I thank you. Yes, that was easy. So I'd like to hear your thoughts because I did, as I said, I did ask a few people if the book is still high on the list in New York City public schools anyway, and it's right there. Sorry, yes. Yes.
Is Harper Lee still a live issue?
Mm-hmm.
And it was her literary editor that approved the publication?
It was a friend of her sister's who found the manuscript in a vault. And this happened to coincide with the sister's dying. So it was convenient, but a nice convenience. And as I said, if you want to take a look at, I can even just pass these around, some of the questions that were asked about how much Harper Lee knew of what the manuscript was about in this part of her life. And it's very clear to me that she was out. I'm sorry, yeah. Natalie.
I was thinking out loud. She wrote the first book in 1957 and was told by the editor, you've got to modify this book. And she writes about a man who's 70 years old. And so she writes the second book about when the man was young. Is it possible she felt that he was an idealist when he was young, and then he became more...
I'm sure it's a good question, and I'm sure the answer is yes, and so did the editor. I mean, this manuscript, when you read the two of them together, clearly it's a different book, a very different perspective. But again, and the reception has been, as you gather, with my not being so forceful about it, it's really created a racial divide. The blacks whom I know are delighted that Watchmen is out there. And they're delighted because in the canon of American literature, set at the period it is, they're saying it is much more truthful to the times.
And when you think of all the things that have happened with the police and all the things we're going through, and we're thinking, what happened to the civil rights movement?
Right. By the way, I just was thinking of the schools and To Kill a Mockingbird. When I read the opening paragraph about her brother Jim, and his fear of not being able to play football was assuaged, and I was just thinking, assuaged, New York City, public school, who's going to pause there? The language, even though it's from the perspective of Scout, you can see they didn't clean up everything. There really is a contravening intelligence that has gone over that. I'm sorry, Anna.
I knew Gregory Peck, and so it was.
Can we speak up? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Doubt.
You want me to?
I just want you to speak up as much as you can so we can.
She knew Gregory Peck.
Oh, okay.
And so he was the perfect product as a human being for that part. And so consequently, the book became alive for everyone, To Kill a Mockingbird, because of the movie. Because you then had an actual Atticus, you had an actual child.
That is true, Lina, though you could make that argument for a great many books that have become movies.
True.
But don't forget that he was coming off Gentleman's Agreement,
Yes.
which was a terrific success.
Yes. And so it only expanded people's belief that this man was, but he was a lawyer in the story. He's a lawyer. Atticus was a product of his environment. You didn't know the complete Atticus in the first book.
I'm going to stop you there because, one, you're right, and two, I want to have some questions. But I appreciate what you're saying, and that's why I think Watchmen gives a fuller account. Yes, he is, as someone said, in the 30s, he couldn't have gotten away, with what he was doing if he tried to be any more radical. But I think the 50s were rougher. And Brown versus Board of Education is still being fought, maybe even more so now. So, that's the power of movies, but the diminution of relying just on a movie. I mean, the book is well written.
Isn't this beautifully written? It's so beautifully written.
By the way, just coincidentally, it's another aside, I happen to have had the pleasure of doing a Q&A interview with an author who was not known to me. His name was Howard Jacobson. And he won the very prestigious Man Booker Award, which is the award in the English-speaking world, in 2010. And he is coming out next month with a book called Shylock Is My Name, in honor of Shakespeare's, the death of Shakespeare, 400th anniversary coming up. A press in England, Hogarth, has asked a number of well-known authors to do a take on a Shakespeare play. And Jacobson has done Merchant of Venice. I wrote to him and I said, what would you tell high school kids who unfortunately are still thrust, that play is still thrust upon them, as well as Julius Caesar, a big mistake. What would you tell them about the anti-Semitism of the time and how it's handled in the play? And his answer was, of course, he would tell them something about the time, but he would tell them that if it's a good play, Shylock is much more complex than any stereotype, and the play is rich, and indeed, he's right. So again, I hope I haven't inadvertently discussed these books with the controversy of race as the core, but it's almost inevitable. And as I said, the heart of good writing is a good subject fine narrative, complex and believable characters, and a theme that is universal as well as reflective of the times it writes about. And I think To Kill a Mockingbird to some extent also. But on that last, Watchmen. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done talk number 2. Another question?
I don't know.
Yes.
What interests me is that most writers, their first book is from a point of view of childhood or about their childhood. I find it very interesting that this was reversed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about that. And there's no explanation for it. It's the way she wrote it. But it's just unusual. Because the voice in To Kill a Mockingbird is so true. And
Yeah, well,
I don't know, what's the answer?
I do. Huck Finn came on Tom Sawyer very quickly, and Tom Sawyer is this, it's like innocence growing up. And Huck Finn is one satiric and at the end, nasty, wonderfully nasty piece of work. And again, a great deal on race. Other comments? Yes.
Huck Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird are about people, but to me at least, or I think the appeal of To Kill a Mockingbird is that's the way we would like it to have been, not the way it really was. And it's interesting.
It's a very good comment because it's what the defenders have said, and they're right. Someone said to, or asked Harper Lee, I don't know in what stage of her decline, how she felt about that. And she said, look, this is my first book. And an editor of note in a very big publishing company is telling me how to make it better. Whom am I to say no? And so she went along with the suggestions. They're really 2 different books. But as I just read in the opening paragraphs, some really terrific writing. And it'll certainly juice you up on Wikipedia looking up all these literary references. I couldn't get over how many there were. Which, by the way, Natalie, reminds me that Harper Lee knew what she was doing in this original manuscript. And whom does she think would have been her readers? She's not just talking to herself. There are many references, and they're not all to Victorian literature. Uncle Jack is almost unintelligible to someone who has not taken a graduate course in Western civilization. It is filled with heavy-duty philosophy, semiotics, you name it, religion, he knows everything. And most of all, speaking of classics, the way the word really means, of ancient Greece, full of the lore, philosophers and plays of Greece. I can't imagine who she thought the audience was, were it not for the fact that she comes out of this Southern, agrarian, intellectual tradition. Any other comments? Yes?
I know that they teach it here in the high school and show the movie in Southampton. And you asked us if we thought Cosetta Watchmen should be in high school curriculums. Having been a high school teacher, I do not think that a 15-year-old is really ready for this book the way you described it, but that's just my opinion.
That's a very good opinion.
On a college level, I think it would be a little different with more mature audiences, but we're talking about, 15, maybe 16-year-olds.
That's a very good point. I remember looking again at Mockingbird and thinking, what is distinctive about the 30s, aside from the race issue, but that's a very particular incident. And the one thing I found was this. Ewe LeMay was Macomb's leading telephone operator. She was entrusted with issuing public announcements, wedding invitations, setting off the fire siren, and giving first aid instructions when Dr. Reynolds was away. You know, it's a Guy Kibbe with the little medical bag coming by. But it purports to be, and probably you're in a better position than I, it purports to be of its time, of the 30s. And I wonder, because so many people, not just kids, are getting their history from literature. I mean, there are kids who don't know Julius Caesar except from the play, and then some. So is there not a responsibility to have some kind of ballast to the way literature is presented? And certainly Watchmen would be that. Okay, it's not on the reading list. It's extra credit.
It would be too bad that it would be on the reading list because it is so poetically, beautifully written. I mean, you can have an argument about, she doesn't really get into it with Atticus until the very end.
Yeah, she gets into it with her uncle.
Yes.
Oh.
So Atticus is not there to protect himself.
Mm.
But also in the first book, To Kill a Mockingbird, it isn't just what he does in the courtroom. He sits quietly and talks to his daughter. And the things that he says to her, you believe this is what Atticus is trying to show her about life and
Well, you're saying the same thing. This is ideal, and I'll conclude with a Victorian quotation that just came to me from Browning. A man's reach should exceed his grasp. And in the world of idealism and good visions, why not? Thank you very much.